collaboration between the Victorian Department of Education and Literate University. The Department of Education commissioned live workshops that have been held across rural, regional and metro Victoria for teaching, leadership and SSS staff to focus on learning difficulties, including dyslexia, throughout 2018. The agenda for these live workshops was based on recommendations from the Program for Students with Disabilities. A series of 5 webinars were then designed as a follow-on opportunity to continue the discussion about how best to support students with learning difficulties, including dyslexia. This 4th webinar focuses on the inextricable relationship between oral language and written language, which is another way of saying literacy. Some of you may have seen this screen, but this is the team of people, including myself and my colleagues, who prepared the live workshops and between us all presented across Victoria. I'm your presenter today, and my name is Tanya Seri, and I'm a senior lecturer at Literate University. For the structure of today's webinar, I'll go through the outline of the topics we'll cover. I first wanted to alert you to 3 online polls that we'll be doing. These are non-compulsory, of course, and if you do choose to participate, your responses will be anonymous, and I'll be wiping all of the results at the conclusion of this workshop. But if you would like to participate, they are spaced out during the workshop. This is the number to plug into your device, and that will then allow you to just key in the code when the poll comes up online. The structure of today's webinar will be as follows. We're going to start by looking at the links between language and literacy, then define language and communication, talk about the oral to literate continuum, briefly review the simple view of reading because it really highlights the critical role of oral language in terms of becoming a competent reader, and then talk about the who, what and how many in regards to poor oral language skills. This picture I've also shown at some of my other webinars and workshops, but I've graded this time because I think there's going to be far less of what I say today that's likely to invoke a feeling like this young girl who's about to take some medicine. I think there's far less today that may be controversial or may be unpalatable to some people in the audience compared to some of the other webinars and certainly the live workshops. Key topics for the live workshops are as follows. I'm just putting them up here and highlighting the aspects that will be prominent or a focus of this webinar. So clearly, oral language competency is the central focus, but like everything we've talked about in the workshops and webinars, what we discussed today is important for all students, but absolutely critical for those with learning challenges. Let's start out looking at the links between language and literacy. So it's literally about how we go from speaking to each other or communicating to being able to do all of the things related to literacy, such as reading, writing, and of course using a variety of technology, including social media. There's many skills that we get from being able to communicate that allow us to get to all of these activities and plenty more on the right-hand side of the screen. Just as the importance of crawling is for young children, developing children as in their journey to learn to walk, they need to learn about spatial awareness, about balance, about movement before they can then go and take some steps. It's exactly the same process. We need oral communication or communication in itself before we can start being able to do the things related to literacy, such as reading, writing, and talking, but more extended talk, such as giving a narrative, telling a story, and doing many of the presentation tasks that are critical not just to academic success, but also to peer-to-peer interactions as well. Here's the first of the 3 polls. For you just to answer in your own view that speech and language are similar in meaning. So the options there are yes, no, I'm not sure, or I've never thought about it. So you can key in the code 345 and your choice of ending to the telephone number on the screen, or if you like to go to the website pollev.com, you can see that on the screen as well. And I'll just wait about 1 minute for people to respond. Just another 10 seconds for this slide. Once the slide goes, you won't be able to respond to this poll. Thank you, and thank you for your honesty, particularly if you've said, I'm not sure or I've never thought about it. The next couple of slides will certainly inform everyone, and those of you, a significant proportion, who said no are absolutely correct. So let's now define speech, language, and communication. Communication is the ultimate aim. Communication is such an important part of being a human. Apart from the importance for academic and social success, it really defines us as being different from other mammals. Now, communication involves these three key elements. This is a very broad brush statement, but speech, which is an oral or verbal task, language, which can be oral or verbal, and also non-oral languages as well. Speech really refers just to the articulation, so the motor act of being able to produce sounds and co-articulate to make words. So when people said no on the previous slide, you were absolutely correct. Speech relates to the abilities or the motor movements that we go through to articulate a single sound or a string of sounds, which is ultimately words and then phrases and sentences. It's not going to be our main focus today. We're going to focus mainly on oral language, otherwise verbal, and talk about the fact that language comprises two broad aspects of both understanding or comprehending and speaking or expressing oneself. But there are also many forms of non-verbal communication. There are wordless languages, such as various sign languages, all which have properties of being a language, which I will come to define shortly. And there are many types of AAC devices, AAC standing for alternative and augmentative communication devices, particularly valuable for individuals, maybe young children, maybe adults as well, who are non-verbal and have assistive technology to help them communicate. For example, this is straightforward verbal communication, person to person. It may be one-to-one or one-to-many. Here's examples of sign language. Obviously, this is a manual language as opposed to a verbal language, but the various movements relate to the grammar and the semantics or the meaning of the language. And here is one example of what is a myriad of various AAC devices for people who are non-verbal. Some people use them 100% of the time, and some use them an AAC device as an adjunct. But our main focus will be on oral or verbal communication for the rest of this webinar. Now, language can be defined in the following way. It's a socially shared code or conventional system that we use to communicate. The critical part there is that it's socially shared, and that is why when you speak to someone who speaks your language, you have a shared code. For example, you have the same word when you want to talk about a bottle. You know that you have the same word, or the conventions are identical. And when you talk to someone who doesn't speak the same language as you, they may have very adequate language skills, but the code is different. So a language is literally a code or a conventional system that we use to communicate. And to use language, we must stick to that. We must, first of all, learn that code, and we must stick to that code. Otherwise, communication will break down. Language can be verbal or non-verbal. Non-verbal languages such as the various sign languages, Auslan, the Australian, ASL, BSL, American and British Sign Language, all verbal languages, all are based on rules. That's the critical thing about language, is that it is a rule-based system. So using language is using knowledge about lots of different rules for how we put words together, how we build words from being one morpheme to multi-morpheme, and so forth. And language development itself involves mastering a series of rules that allow us to be able to use language for whatever purpose, so to be able to generate anything. For example, if I asked you all to just give me 2 sentences about your day-to-day, I would get, as many of you are listening now, I would get that many different sentences because you have the rules or the structures in place to generate anything you want using the language skills that you all have. Let's just go back to some basics about what we mean by oral language and being competent in using oral language. It is the ability to both express and understand, because it is always a two-way process that underpins what communication is. It's certainly not just about speaking. Language is naturally acquired with exponential growth in the early years prior to school. If you think about what an infant is born with, very early on in their first few weeks and months, they will start smiling and vocalising and making their needs met. But so much happens from those early weeks and months to the time that children arrive at school. We never, ever, ever get that exponential growth back at all. And that's why those years are so critical for building strong oral language foundations. It's also exactly why it always gets harder and harder as we get a bit older to learn a second or a third language. Although we have this exponential growth period from pretty much the first few weeks of life right through till around 4 and 5, language continues to grow right through the school years and beyond. Still today, we all have the capacity to grow our oral language by learning new vocabulary, new concepts. So we want the language of the children right at the end of this screen. They should have language that's much, much more complex than the children who are just entering school, the first pair of children. If that wasn't the case, if the older students were using language at the same complexity as the younger children, that would be a problem. That would be a language disorder in those older students. We know that not all children arrive at school with equally well-developed oral language, and we will see shortly that that is a significant risk factor when it comes to successfully learning to read. Being competent with oral language, particularly at the start of one's school life, is absolutely the basis for transitioning to become literate, to be able to read, spell and write. And that's because once we can read, which usually for many, the majority of students will occur by the mid-primary years, we then grow our oral language competency mainly through the literate modality rather than that early years where we're just these sponges to learning languages in preschool children. We don't ever get that time back again. So once we are literate, the majority of continued growth in oral language, for example, expanding vocabulary, using more complex language styles, using much more figurative or inferential language rather than concrete language, we gain a lot of that really through the written medium. That means getting a good start to reading not only means we get off to good reading and then spelling and writing, but also means we get this additional advantage of continuing to grow our oral language almost seamlessly just by engaging with literate tasks. And so a really nice cycle develops. We read more, we grow our oral language, allows us to read more complex tasks, which grows our oral language further, and so the cycle goes. So if that process gets interrupted in that downward arrow, in not getting a good start to learning to read, it means that children are really at a double risk of being doubly disadvantaged. Not only do they have reduced experiences with engaging with text and reading, they also are at risk of a reduced or restricted growth of their own oral language and background knowledge, and that will have its own set of implications for ongoing academic and social success as well. It really comes down to the fact that learning to read and become literate is a language-based task. And to become literate, children have to draw on their own knowledge about how language works, essentially the rules that guide language. And to become literate, they are crossing the bridge into using their oral language as literally the springboard to cross the bridge into becoming literate. A brief couple of slides about the development of language. It's not a big focus because the aim of most of us watching this webinar will be thinking about school-age students, either young or perhaps older students. But considering that such an enormous amount happens from infancy to the point in time where children are entering school. First of all, the second poll that I'd like you to consider is the following, that oral language and literacy are both acquired fairly naturally. So once again, your options are yes, they are both acquired fairly naturally. No, they're not both acquired fairly naturally, or one of them is and one of them isn't. Or I'm not sure, or I've never thought about it. So I'll leave you about 1 minute to respond to this poll. And another 10 seconds on this slide before we move on. Okay, thank you. So we've got more clarity, or yeses or nos, but clearly more nos, and that is the correct answer, no. And the next few slides will talk more to the fact that oral language is acquired fairly naturally for the very vast majority of students, but learning to become literate is an imposed task. It imposes itself on our oral language competencies. And to start explaining this, I'd like to draw the distinction between biologically primary knowledge and biologically secondary knowledge. Biologically primary knowledge and skills are the things that we acquire effortlessly by virtue of being human. No one teaches us how to do skills that are considered biologically primary. Oral language, acquiring oral language is one of those biologically primary skills. We do it effortlessly. No parent, no childcare, early childhood teacher teaches students every single word they know in their vocabulary, or how to build words from happy to unhappy, or how to combine sounds so that they meet the phonological rules of the language. Oral language is acquired very effortlessly for the vast majority of children. Some children will do it meeting all their milestones. Others will do it more slowly, without any doubt. But it's something that we just acquire through our process of maturation from birth, through those early years when that exponential growth is occurring. Other examples of biologically primary skills and knowledge are things like fine motor and gross motor skills, social communication, knowing when to make eye contact with people when they talk to you. But oral language is considered biologically primary, and again, one of the things that distinguishes humans from many other creatures. Biologically secondary knowledge is very different. Biologically secondary knowledge are the skills and abilities that must be taught. They're domain-specific competencies that if no one taught us how to do certain things, we wouldn't actually learn those skills. For example, playing golf for me is a domain-specific competency that I have never ever mastered, but someone has tried to teach me. But in terms of thinking about language and literacy, literacy is a learned skill. Literacy is imposed on our oral language skills. We are not hardwired to become literate in the same way that we are hardwired to acquire oral language skills. So I've highlighted two key words that are really important to me when I think about language competency and literacy competency. I talk about language competency as being acquired, meaning that it's a fairly passive process, that we just have to have really rich linguistic experiences, but many of our opportunities to learn language are embedded into everyday activities, whereas we learn to become literate, meaning it's a more active process of someone having to teach the child, the student, to become literate, imposing our skills around oral language in order to become literate. So there's a really important distinction there. Once again, that is probably one area that I think there has been a lot of debate, underpinned by the reading wars, where one view is that learning to become literate is natural, like learning to become oral communicators. But the evidence is in that learning to become literate is a biologically secondary skill that needs to be taught. Essentially, making sense of this, what are squiggles on a page, as you can see on the screen. We need someone to tell us that curly sound is a letter S, and all of the other properties of the different sounds and their combinations. A few key facts about language development leading up to getting to school. Young children acquire the ability to speak words aloud. Children on average get their first word at about age 1 and gradually learn to associate or combine those words to make short phrases and then sentences and beyond. There are expected milestones for this very complex and really wonderful but dynamic process of learning to communicate, and those milestones help many professionals such as speech pathologists, paediatricians, kindergarten teachers work out if a child is on track or not with their language development. But by age 4 or 5, essentially the time or the age that children are entering kindergarten and then school, children have acquired such a huge language bank. They have a very large vocabulary that includes several thousand words. They can talk about all sorts of topics, and they can understand they can understand story grammar. They can tell you about events. Again, it won't be as sophisticated as it should be in time, but they are very functional communicators, all being well with language development. Unfortunately, language is not routinely assessed in young children, and many children whose language isn't developing on track, they don't look or sound any different at just first glance. So there is certainly a risk that low language skills can be overlooked unless they are very, very overt. The students who have very limited language output and clearly are not understanding a lot of what's being spoken to them. We know that entering school with low language levels is a significant risk factor for learning to successfully read. And we also know that children who are referred for a variety of supports, including paediatricians, school support services, psychologists, and other people from other disciplines, very commonly they're overrepresented with students who have less well-developed language skills for a variety of reasons, maybe for language and learning, but also maybe for some social difficulties as well. This is a document that you can freely download from the Speech Pathology Australia website. They've created a document called Communication Milestones, and it goes from 0 to 5, but I wanted to show you the 5-year-old page because it's relevant certainly for teachers in the early years of school. There is some nice pictures underneath that large blue box that I put on the screen, but I'm going to just highlight some things on this document for you. First of all, I wanted to highlight that it involves both understanding and speaking, equally important. A lot of people start thinking about language as output, but equally important is the input or the understanding. So if we look at some of the essential things that 5-year-olds can usually do at age 5, they can understand a lot of words, particularly some more conceptual words, such as words related to time, so things like before, after, now, yesterday, tomorrow. They can also understand instructions without having to consciously stop and think or process the information. So that's really important for getting along adequately in school, following instructions, following task requirements. And you can see there's some other things as well. In terms of the speaking or the output, we know that children at age 5 can usually form well-constructed sentences that can be understood by most people. By school entry, children have most of their speech sounds. There's a couple that they might not have mastered that's quite normal. Often the letter the sound and the th sound might not be quite mastered, but the very vast majority of sounds are usually mastered by 5-year-olds at school entry, and therefore they can make themselves understood both in terms of forming well-constructed sentences, and their speech output should also be pretty clear, in fact, very clear. They can tell simple short stories, which tells us that they're learning about narrative structure, which is again going to be really important for many, many academic tasks. And they can use a lot of tense accurately. So we have lots of verbs, for example, that follow the standard conventions, such as jump, to say it in the past tense is jumped, but also we expect 5-year-olds to be using a lot of the irregular past tense verbs, such as drank instead of drinked. I drank my juice instead of I drinked my juice. So 5-year-olds, children entering school, are very functional communicators. This is Jay at the top of the screen, who's 2 years, 10 months, and these statements that he's uttered are completely normal for a child at his age. That I do my own self, and Holly got babies in him's tummy. Really great attempts. It's clear what he's talking about, but there's a lot of grammatical construction errors in there, which is completely acceptable for a child approaching 3rd birthday. However, Shay, who is in her 1st year of school, has mastered all of those things and making grammatically accurate statements. She's got that's mine instead of that my, I can do it myself, and Holly's got 2 babies in her tummy. So if we just unpack the difference between some of those utterances, Shay has managed to sort out the pronoun use in terms of the gender and the case. Instead of hims, she's able to say her tummy. She's also been able to use a contracted form instead of Holly got, so there's bits missing. Holly has got. We've now got Holly's got, or it could be Holly has got 2 babies. And that my has become that's mine, once again with the contracted form and the right version of that, that statement, that mine, that has become that's mine. So let's now just consider the oral written language continuum, which is really the heart of what I want to talk about today. There is a view among many people, I think generally in the community and some within education, that we have oral language, which is what happens in the preschool years, learn to speak, learn to understand, learn to communicate, and then come to school and learn all about written language, learn to read, spell and write. And I would like to dispel that as a myth and take that away, that distinction, and instead consider oral language and written language or literacy on a continuum, as that bottom arrow shows, and really to do away with that artificial split between the middle. And the reasons I'd like to put this forward are as follows. In terms of written language, there is a lot that can and ideally should be happening in the years prior to school. Emergent literacy, the skills that children learn about literacy, about books, things like how books work, book orientation, that actually the squiggles on the page have meaning, that not just squiggles or extra pictures. There's so many factors related to emergent literacy that can be acquired alongside oral language development, and it's critical that children come to school with emergent literacy as well as well-developed oral language skills, so that when they arrive at school, the tasks can be about learning to read as opposed to learning about how books and print works. Similarly, oral language certainly doesn't stop in those preschool years in terms of development. Oral language must keep growing so that the students can keep up with the academic demands, including expanded writing demands. So oral language, we need to be able to speak and hear and understand at a verbal level. And if we can't do that, we are certainly not going to be able to do it in a written level. So oral language certainly doesn't stop its growth and development once children enter school. Exponentially, it will slow down, but oral language must continue to grow throughout. And that's why I really encourage us all to be thinking about language as a continuum in the oral and written modalities, rather than this divide, which in many ways is highly artificial. The core components of language. There are 5 key components of language that we must all have. If we only have some of those core components, we're not going to be functional and able communicators. And these are the core components. We have phonology, and that's how sounds are combined to form words. Our language and any language has phonological rules which dictate or determine how we can combine some sounds into words that are essentially legal, and how some sound combinations are illegal in any language, meaning they just sound wrong. Morphology is how words are built from being one morpheme, a single word such as table, how it can be built to be tables, for example, the plural form. Morphology is absolutely critical because our language, English, is a morphophonemic language. It's full of words that contain many more than one single morpheme. Syntax is how words are combined, so how we put words together to make phrases and sentences, and how the rules, particularly in terms of the word order. Then the semantics, how meaning is applied. That relates to vocabulary, but it also importantly relates to the way that we use language at a figurative level rather than just at a concrete level. And then pragmatics, how we use language for functional purposes. For example, how we know how to communicate and what type of language to use when we talk to our friends versus when we go for a job interview. We need to bring our pragmatic knowledge to the table to determine what style of language we should be using. Morphology and syntax are essentially the grammar of the language, and grammar is particularly rule-based. If we look at the rules of phonology, we know that in our language we can have CVC words, in the example here, ib, making rib, and we can also have this word which has 4 sounds, k, ib, because in our language we can have 2 sounds such as C and R, making kr at the beginning of words, but we would never have in our language a word ending in that cluster, that blend of kr. And we know that we don't have it the reverse way. We don't have RC as a cluster in that order as well. So that's an illegal phonological rule. In terms of morphology, we would never have had the word unfriend before Facebook overtook our lives, but now we can unfriend somebody. So we've added the un to friend to form a verb of I will unfriend that person. So we've built onto the base word friend to make it unfriend. We can have the base word act, and then we can make it react. And we can also have unfriendliness. I can experience unfriendliness sometimes. So morphology is critical, and particularly because the very vast majority of words that we're all using in our everyday communication are full of multi-morpheme words, such as those on the screen. The rules about syntax and, to a degree, semantics are as follows. Syntax really relates to the word order. So we have a spotty dog in English. We have the rule order of adjective noun, whereas in a language such as French, they have the reverse order. They have dog spotty. As it gets longer, we have that's my spotty dog. And you can see here that there's been the addition of the that is or that's as well. So we have to follow rules. If I said that's spotty my dog, that again would not sit, you would intuitively know that that was an incorrect syntactic statement. Whilst we can have correct word order, we also can have double meaning or other idioms. So we can have it's raining cats and dogs. So at a concrete level, that doesn't make sense, but we all know that that is a statement reflecting something like it's just overwhelming, it's pouring. It's raining cats and dogs, which is syntactically correct, and semantically is not correct at a very concrete level, but we know that it's raining cats and dogs has a secondary meaning. So putting it together with all those core components of oral language, we've looked at them on the slide before, they're absolutely critical for us to be able to use oral language for lots of higher order purposes that you can see on the screen, notably that written language is one of those higher order purposes and highlights how reliant becoming competent with literacy is on being competent with oral language skills. We know that oral language competence is foundational for learning to read, but I'd like to just show you a couple of slides to demonstrate that. Hugh Katz is a fabulous researcher and he's done with his work with his colleagues some fantastic work looking at how children at school entry progress with their reading skills, and he split those children into two groups: children who entered school with good language skills, oral language skills, and those who were behind with their language development. Now this graph here shows you word reading skills of children from the 2nd to the 10th grade. The solid line are the children who entered school with good language skills, and the dotted line are the children who entered school with less well, or behind in language. And this is how they performed on their ability to read single words. So you can see that over all of those years, there is a gap. The children who've entered school with less well-developed oral language skills have not caught up to their peers who've entered school with good language skills. That arrows that I've added in myself, I hardly had to change the size of the arrows. So it tells me that there was a constant gap. It didn't widen, but it didn't shrink either. But when we look at the same children and we measure their reading comprehension, not their word reading scores, same children, same year levels, we can see here that there is a gap between the reading comprehension of students whose language was good versus behind, but in fact over time the gap has widened. So that really highlights the absolute importance, or how much of a risk factor entering school with less well-developed oral language skills are. When we just look at the results for children at year of school, YOS year of school 2 and 4, we can see in the first column that the light grey column are the children who entered school with good language skills. We had 8.6 of those children, 8.6% of children who had difficulties with reading. So it wasn't completely protective to have good language skills, because about 8% had some reading difficulties, but that was in comparison to over 50% of children who had low language skills at school entry. At year of school 2, over 50% were having reading difficulties, and if you took that to the bottom quartile, it was nearly 70%. At year of school 4, it hadn't changed much. It was 8.2% of children with good language at school entry still having difficulties with reading, but again, the numbers are much, much higher for the children who entered school behind in language, again, around 50% and 65% if we go to the bottom quartile of children. So it really tells us, highlights again, that how important oral language competency is for laying successful foundations for learning to read. And the vast majority of students who enter school with good language skills, age appropriate, will have no difficulties learning to read, compared to students whose language skills at school entry are behind, they are at much more significant risk, as those graphs and charts showed you. And that means that there's a significant risk of academic consequences or poor consequences, and a whole host of longer-term negative psychosocial consequences as well. We still need to protect or be mindful of all students, even those who enter school with adequate language skills, because we still know that the quality of the classroom instructional environment needs to be absolutely evidence-based teaching practices, but certainly entering school with well-developed oral language competency is a very significant protective factor. And this is all in context of the simple view of reading. We know that reading is a biologically secondary skill that students must learn to be able to become literate, and that ultimately the aim of any reading is to comprehend what we read. But the simple view of reading reinforces that oral language competency, which is biologically primary, is absolutely a necessary precursor for learning to read and spell. And that's because the simple view of reading states the following: that reading comprehension, the ultimate aim of reading, relies on two central skills, and one of those is decoding, and that's been a focus of an earlier webinar, and the other is oral language comprehension. And because it's a product, we need to have word recognition times oral language comprehension. If a student doesn't have good oral language comprehension, they may be able to decode well, but suddenly when the text demands become more complex, those students are going to run into significant difficulties, because if they can't understand adequately what they're hearing, they are certainly not going to be able to understand it when there's the added task of actually decoding and then making sense of what it is that they're reading. There are a number of academic consequences for students with poor oral language competency, well beyond just learning to get the words off the page. Without any doubt, reading, spelling and writing is likely to be compromised, but so is using narrative discourse, both at a written and a spoken level. Things like giving a verbal presentation or in a written form for any curriculum-related topics is going to be challenging for students whose language skills are not on par with where their age and year level expects them to be. They will also have a lot of difficulty understanding indirect requests and sarcasm. We know that we use a lot of indirect ways of speaking. We have a lot of inferential language. So having low oral language competency puts people at risk for when what they're hearing is not absolutely concrete. We also know that there's significant challenges in terms of a lot of social skills, like getting jokes, understanding idioms, keeping up with social banter, discerning good humour from unintended humour, and the risk of trying to be funny and possibly causing offence, which again interrupts a lot of peer-to-peer relationships, and once again indirect instructions, or even just being able to share stories, being able to have a narrative structure to tell your peers what you did on the weekend or about a particular event as well. So the consequences are far and wide-reaching. Some of these current statements, again, this could be very different in a year's time, but if a student says, "Oh my God, I'm weak," that actually means that's short for "that was funny." So again, not knowing the double meaning of "I'm weak" would sound very odd to someone. Similarly, "you are goat." Some of you may know these statements, others of you may not, but "you are goat" is a way of saying you are the greatest of all time. So to keep up with the playground and social banter, kids need to have these at their fingertips, and this is where it gets much more figurative and inferential. Similarly, this one might take you a moment, it took me a moment. "If at first you don't succeed, skydiving is not for you." That's an attempt at humour, but again, one needs a level of sophistication with the oral language to make sense of that statement. Similarly, abstract language goes well beyond the literal, is dotted through so much of the text that students must read from mid-primary on. The text that novels and, of course, non-fiction texts are full of a lot of non-literal language, such as "the angry clouds," "let's jump ship," statements such as "I sank into the couch," "that tennis final was a marathon," which we all understand, but if one is able to only interpret or understand language at a concrete level, of course they would make very little or no sense at all. When we go back to the grammar, simple sentences that consist of one clause may be within some children's repertoire. For example, at the party, the kids played footy, but if we just listened to people speaking in simple sentences one after the other, it would become very, very laborious and would certainly not be acceptable in the written language that students are expected to be writing. So they should be able to at least use compound sentences, compound being a sentence containing two main clauses. At the party, the kids played footy and ate garbage. Now, garbage, again, is a way of saying, party food. But again, for some students, that might be really difficult to understand. But we really want students to be writing in a lot of complex sentences. That's how we talk. That's how we expect a lot of writing to be. So at the party, the kids played footy, even though the weather was dreadful, a complex sentence containing one main clause and at least one dependent clause. And in this case, the dependent clause, even though the weather was dreadful, is dependent on that first main clause. At the party, the kids played footy. And really importantly, language skills need to really become sophisticated so that students are able to use a lot of cohesive devices, which is just ways of assisting the audience, the listener or the reader, to make sense of the links that the speaker is making. For example, at the party, the kids played footy, and yet that was the cohesive device. None of them, and you would know that them refers to the kids, none of them were keen AFL supporters. That is a sentence that should be within the reach of many 9, 10-year-old students for both listening, producing, and of course, reading and writing. The last poll, my confidence in identifying a student with poor oral language competency, and the 4 options: high, so-so, low, and I'm not sure. We've got about 3 minutes to go of this entire podcast. I'm probably going to be talking for about another 5 minutes instead of 3 minutes, but I'll give you a moment to complete this poll. And just another 10 seconds. Thank you. I can see that it's just starting to kick in now, but I will move on because we are going to run out of time. But thank you for contributing to this last poll. Let's finish up with talking about the who, what, and how many. What the reality of who actually has language difficulties and what it actually might look like. We know that if there is a classroom full of students, that there will be a small percentage, typically around 5 to 7% of all children at school entry who are having difficulties with oral language. So one could virtually guarantee that in any particular class there will be a small handful of students whose language skills are behind their peers, and that may continue on. This is an example of a child about to enter school and this child's language development was not on track, it was behind. So in this task, it's a coloured picture that I've only been able to scan black and white, but the question is, tell me what the man is doing, and the statement of a child 4.5 years old said, the cat eating his shoe because he climbed up the ladder. So what you can see there is a lot of content words, but it's missing the glue that holds that sentence together. And that's often a key sign. If a sentence almost sounds like it's on target in terms of the meaning, but is missing a lot of the glue, it's often the morphological features that are missing. That is a sign that the child may well be behind in language. On a language test from the Clinical Evaluation of Language Functioning, a student in grade 5, when asked to put these words in a sentence, said for the word children, he said, children is playing on their electronic toy. And I'll show you the others for you to read. But again, you can see that they're incomplete in some way or other, and none of them are particularly complex in their structure. There's an attempt at being complex with by the time they finish lunch, they can go out to play, but in that example, tense is not working well. So in conclusion, so that we can be able to use language for all of its wonderful purposes and then be able to have a bit of a laugh at the expense of language with this, for example, this statement. However, there is no language wherein a double positive can form a negative. Cost cutting. We can have so much pleasure from language as such an enjoyable tool as well as all of its purposes. In sum, what we've talked about today is oral language and considering it as a biologically primary skill that we acquire effortlessly. It's only a very, very small percentage of young children who don't acquire it effortlessly, even if some children will be doing it at a slower pace. That students entering school with less well-developed oral language are entering with significant risk for successfully learning to read. That language must continue to grow and expand as the students progress through school and of course beyond, but particularly throughout the academic years, oral and verbal language skills must continue to grow as the student moves higher up the school journey. And finally, that reading comprehension is highly dependent on oral language competencies. So thank you very much for your time and for those of you who contributed to the poll. If you would like to contact any of us, our addresses are here, and most of us are fairly active, some more than others, on Twitter as well. Thank you very much for your time today.